After the war, which ended in 1945, then my parents were able to get a car, and they made it a point to start to travel with us in the summer. And I remember our taking an extended vacation up through Michigan and the Upper Peninsula. I remember staying in the Upper Peninsula in little roadside cottages. I remember going to the Tequamanon Falls, which for me was the first experience of seeing a natural waterfalls, and they're beautiful. I have a sister who's 3 years younger than I am. Her name is Barbara. And I have a brother who's 11 years younger than I am, whose name is Tom. Tom and his family live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Barbara lives in Gallatin, Tennessee. We were a migrant family in Toledo. I started out as an infant living on Waverly Avenue in Toledo. That was in the neighborhood where my father and my mother both had grown up, and it was also just a couple of blocks from the Woodstock Avenue Church of God, where my mother and my father met and were married. At about age 3, we moved to another house on Palmwood Avenue in Toledo. This too was in the same neighborhood, but it was a little bit larger home, because by that time we had my sister born. Lived there until I was 6 years old, at which time we moved to the south end of Toledo on Kalima Drive. And we lived on Kalima Drive until I finished 6th grade, at which time we moved to Lincoln Avenue. Lincoln Avenue, I lived there until I was a junior in high school, and the family moved from there to Goodale Avenue. And I lived there with the family until I went to college. Probably my best friend, still one of my very best friends, was Art Davey. One of the things I remember about that with Art, and we often talk about it, recall it, was that our homes were just one block from a large, heavy machinery manufacturing company called the E.W. Bliss Manufacturing. They manufactured huge presses that were used then in the manufacturing of auto parts and bodies and so on. One of the buildings related to that large company was just at the end of our street, and it was a huge warehouse kind of building in which they stored all of their wood dyes. Back then, dyes or the patterns for the dyes were wood. But they stored them in this warehouse, and when you went into that warehouse, it had just a wonderful aroma of wood, a wood aroma. And I remember Art and I just loved to go down there and sneak into the warehouse. We were obviously not allowed to be there by either of our parents, but we would sneak in and we would roam through that warehouse. Now, here we were, like 3 or 4 year old kids, and that would never happen today. But we roamed our neighborhood very freely, even into territories that our parents wouldn't like to know. Art Davey now lives in the Meridian, Mississippi area and has lived there for many, many years. My first job was as a paper boy. I got a paper route with 75 customers when I was 10 years old. Now, there was a reason why I was interested in getting the paper route. It wasn't so much for the money I would make, because you didn't make much money as a paper boy, but it was a way I got a bicycle. My folks were hesitant to get me a bicycle for whatever reason, but once I got the paper route, then we had to have a bicycle. And so I got a bicycle with a nice big basket on the front of it, and I had this daily paper route. Eventually, I picked up the Sunday route also. In Toledo, you had a weekly route, and then you had a Sunday route. And sometimes different people owned the Sunday route than owned the daily route, and that was my case. But eventually I was able to get the Sunday route, so I had a 7-day-a-week paper route. And I had that route until I was 13 years old when we moved to Lincoln. I think my first car was a 1950 Plymouth. And the one thing I remember most about that car is it was the car that I had when Joyce and I were dating, which means that would have been in 1957 is when I owned the car. And I remember that on the driver's side, the floorboard was rotted through, and I just had a piece of plywood covering that up. But without the plywood, you could see the road through that car. But I was involved with the sports activities as a student manager. It was football and track and field that I was a student manager. My last 2 years, I was even in a more focused area of that. I was in the athletic training part of it, so I got to know the players very well, because oftentimes I was helping them with their leg cramps and other aspects of the physical development that they were engaged in. During the war, we were engaged in drills. We would call them air warning drills. In the schools, we would have the usual fire drills, which are still typical. But we had the drills related to the concerns about bombing that might happen, and so whenever we would get that alert, we would go under our desks. But before going under our desks, each of us in the classroom may have had another assignment. For instance, one of the first assignments was you pull the blinds. You turn out all the lights, and then you go under your desk to protect you from anything that might happen or be falling on you. That was pretty much it. We had the air raid drills in our homes in the evening, because the important thing there was that there be no light show through from inside home. But the air raid sirens would blow. You would then pull all the blinds, turn out the lights, and remain inside the house. Now, that was policed very rigidly. We had in every neighborhood, we had an air raid warden, a person who was deputized to walk the streets whenever we were in a warning situation. And he would walk the streets to determine if any light was emanating from anywhere. If there was light showing from your home, you were subject to being charged as an offense. My recollection of how wars ended in my lifetime really focus in on the Second World War, because in my lifetime that's the only war that ended in what has been deemed a real victory. And there was great celebration. There was celebration upon the end of the war in Europe, VE Day. I remember going with my family, getting on the bus and going to downtown Toledo, where there was parades, and there was just an impromptu parade, but crowds of people went into downtown Toledo. We would take pie pans, pie tins, and silverware, and we would take them and just clang them, making noise. Any kind of a noisemaker you could come up with, you took it with you downtown in this impromptu celebration. I remember that very distinctly, and that happened on VE Day, and then it happened on VJ Day when we completed the Second World War with the surrender of Japan. So those are the 2 days that I remember specifically related to the endings of wars. All the other wars ended in a state of uncertainty. Of course, it was the Second World War where we actually had great impact upon our daily life in a way that none of the other wars had caused an impact on our life. None of the other wars brought rationing. None of the other wars brought scarcity of products here on the home front. None of the other wars took an inordinate number of men, relatively speaking, out of the regular workforce. So there was a marked difference in the Second World War's ending and all the others, in my recall. The life during and after the Depression is very vague in my mind. I was so young that I don't think I can identify a real awareness or feeling. It's only in retrospect that I realize that I was born to a family that had little or no means, and that I was raised, at least in the first 6 years of my life, in that kind of a situation. We lived in what now would be considered very poor housing, and we lived a very, very modest life. I remember our being dependent upon the typical kinds of delivery of milk products. We had an ice box. We did not have an electric refrigerator. We had a very primitive kind of gas stove with an oven. So I just remember those as being probably effects of the Depression on my family life, but I didn't realize that at the time. I think they probably had electric refrigerators in the 30s. I was born in 1936, and I expect that there were electric refrigerators available, but they were not affordable, because I just remember that we weren't the only family that relied upon an ice man to bring the huge chunks of ice to our home on a regular basis. The sign that we had to put in the front window to let the iceman know what size block of ice we wanted. You had a sign. One half of the sign had a 25 on it, and the other half of the sign had a 50 on it. And you just would turn the sign and put it in your window if you wanted a 25-pound block of ice or a 50-pound block of ice. I remember also as a kid, again, 3-4 years old, then following the iceman down the street, particularly in the summer when it was so hot, and he would chip off a piece of ice and give it to us to suck on as we sort of followed him like almost the Pied Piper. But we also then had the milkman, and the milkman came. In fact, initially, I think our milkman, as a very young child, I have an image of our milkman coming in a horse-drawn car, wagon, and then it was motorized and so on. But the milkman would come and would leave the bottles of milk in a milk box that would sit on the outside of our porch, outside of the door on the porch. We would put the empty bottles in the box. He would take the empty bottles and replace them with a like number. And that's how he knew how much to leave. By the time I started school, we had moved to Kalima Drive. And our school was Burroughs Elementary School, which was like 4 blocks away. We walked to school. There was no busing in those days. If you lived far enough from school that you had to ride a bus or couldn't walk, you took public transportation. But in my case, it was 4 blocks away. School started at 8:30 in the morning, and then stopped at 11:30, and then started again at 1 o'clock, and stopped at 3:30. So we would walk to school, be there from 8:30 to 11:30, and then we walked home for lunch. School did not have any cafeteria or food service, so we walked home for lunch, but was back at school at 1 o'clock until 3:30, when we would then be dismissed to go home. In my case, once I got my paper route, I would immediately go from school at 3:30 a mile away to pick up my papers at the newspaper distribution place and deliver them on my paper route. Now, an interesting thing there is I had a bicycle now when I had my paper route, but the only I could not ride it to school except that I needed it for my paper route, so I got special permission to bring my bicycle to school. Otherwise, I would have had to have walked, but because I had a job, I could bring my bicycle to school, and then I could ride my bicycle from school to get my papers. I went to the Toledo Zoo many times as a very young child. That was a place that we would go as a family. It was an excellent zoo in that day, and it still is one of the world popular and famous zoos even today. Wonder Valley was not there when I was there as a kid. That's a feature that came on afterward. So that's where we took our kids to see Wonder Valley, as well as the larger zoo. But as a kid, we would go, and it was just a very traditional zoo. That zoo came about. It came about as a result of the WPA, which was a Depression employment program, a National Depression employment program. Works Progress Administration is what it was called. It was a Depression, as I say, a Depression works program. And it was through that program that many structures were built, including the structures that even are there now for the zoo, and other structures in the city. The main structure that I remember is the main building at the University of Toledo, was built by the WPA program. When I went to the zoo as a kid, the attraction there was across the street, across Broadway Avenue from the zoo, was an amusement park, Walbridge Park we called it. And for its day, it was a fine amusement park with merry-go-round and tilt-a-whirls and really quite an array of entertainment. And that was the thing that attracted us there, as well as the zoo. That was not a pedestrian mall at the time, but it is now.
Okay.
Those were main streets in the downtown area. The department stores that were there at the time in that location were the Tidke's store, which Tidke's store would be sort of our Walmart. It would be in the middle and low range cost of products. Then there was a Lamson's department store, which was an upper end department store. There was a LaSalle and Cook's department store. There was a Sears store. There was a Montgomery and Ward store. Those are the department stores, and of course that's where everything was. We didn't have the shopping malls out around the perimeter of the town yet, and so we went to those streets that you mentioned, and in that general area would be all of the large department stores and specialty shops. Oh wow, I don't know that I can identify a worst winter storm. My recall is that we had snow every year from late November well into February, and it just seemed to me, and my recall is that it was constant. Now I expect that we had the thaws and didn't have ground snow cover all the time as I remember it, but my remembrance is that we just had snow constantly. We were able to sled and ice skate on the city park ponds all through that time, and I have just really a lot of good memories of sledding on a hill that was nearby my home, but then sledding in the parks where they had the hills, and they maintained them for sledding and tobogganing. And then they also maintained the city ponds for ice skating, and they would provide wood for large bonfires. And I just remember as a kid and even into my youth enjoying ice skating and sledding and tobogganing throughout an extended period of time.